Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today we've got a little blast from the past for you. Before there was fancy lenses like Canon's RF 28-70, F2, there was this, Sigma's 24 to 35 millimeter F2 DG HSM. In this case for Canon EF mount, but various DSLR mounts at the time. And when this lens was released, it was the only thing like it. No one had done anything like that in a constant f2 zoom before. So this was a really compelling lens. It was actually really well reviewed and considered quite sharp. That said, sharp, fast, wide, these are things that could make a lens good for astrophotography. So does this zoom lens hold up for astrophotography? Well, we're going to find out. Here, of course, we've got the Canon EF mount version, but we're going to Voltron it here with the Sigma MC11, I think, adapter. And I've got a third-party tripod foot here to actually clamp onto the adapter, which can allow this lens to actually go full Arca Swiss. And I actually enjoy using it like this because this lens is quite heavy. I have used it, just stock on DSLRs before, and that's been okay, but you know what? Having this much weight hanging off the end of a Sony camera, I'd rather have this tripod foot. I could also see using this lens with something like a Canon 6D or 5D Mark III, something, especially if it was astro modified, that might give a good experience, but that remains to be seen because we need to look at the optical quality of this lens. As is the case with a lot of Sigma's art lenses of this era, we've got a zoom lens, really short throw, obviously, and we've got an mechanically coupled focus ring here, which is really nice. And it's nice and damp. I enjoy it. We've got, of course, the hyperfocal distance indicator there and an AF/MF switch. And that's it. If we take a peek, we've got a pedal hood around an 82 millimeter filter thread. And while the front element does not take up the whole 82 millimeters, this lens is slightly overbuilt, even at an f2 aperture. It's actually not a bad sized front element, if I'm being honest. So I am anxious to see how it actually performs. So without any further ado, let's pop over to Lightroom and we'll see if this is actually worth carrying in your bag in 2020, whatever it is. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. We're going to look at the rather niche Sigma 24 to 35 millimeter f2 DG HSM art lens, released in 2015 for all kinds of different camera mounts back in DSLR times. And this was, at the time, kind of a really revelation of a lens. Like an f2 zoom lens was not something that there was around for full frame or otherwise. So it made a big splash, even though it only had a fairly limited range. And it was considered quite good and sharp at the time as well, considering how fast it was. So this was a passion lens for me. Used it for some video stuff, used it for some walk around stuff. It was really nice. Let's see how it does for astro. We're going to try and speed run this one, even though there's a ton of samples here. So bear with me. As always, my method is to try and take tracked and untracked samples if it's a wide angle lens. I use these, in this case, A7R Mark V from Sony 60 megapixel sensor for the 60-second tracked shots, all tracked with Fornax Mounts LighTrack II portable star tracker. Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor, so if you're interested in learning more about that, head over to ferventastronomy.com. Today, I don't have any static tripod shots, actually, and that's probably because it was a pain in the butt to do all of these, and f2 isn't really that fast. It isn't really fast enough for tripod shots anyway. And keep in mind that this is a 60-second exposure, right? So not super bright, but there you go. These shots are all taken at ISO 320 on the A7R Mark V, which is that camera's second base ISO, or its second quote-unquote real ISO. If you want to learn more about that, it's called ISO invariance. You can check the link in the description, which will bring you back to Fervent Astronomy's website, where there's a bunch of resources, including a nice article written by smart people who are not me on ISO invariance. You'll also find a link to these samples if you want to pixel peep them. So feel free to do that, download them. As always, I just ask you to respect my copyright and use them for the personal purpose of assessing the lens's performance. Please don't redistribute them anywhere, online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as a basis for your own review. Please use them in good faith for the purposes for which I'm providing them. And essentially, just to give you the Coles notes on the ISO 320 thing, essentially, if I shoot at anything above ISO 320 with this camera, the results are indistinguishable from me just taking one of these 320 shots and boosting the exposure in post. Caveat being at the same exposure time with the same f-stop. The camera is just digitally boosting the exposure in post itself when I use a higher ISO, and I'm not gaining anything. In fact, you might lose a little bit of highlight detail if the highlights clip at the higher ISO values. Keep that in mind. Go read that article if you want. Just know that for this camera, there's no point in using a different ISO. I don't get different results. That being said, everything here is very dark, so we're going to boost the exposure like magic. Now that everything is 2 stops brighter, we actually have some stuff to look at. So we're gonna dive in here, and like I said, we're gonna try and speed run this. This is F2 at 24 millimeters, and right off the bat, we've got some vignetting. I don't really think we're gonna have to worry about things like contrast because, to be honest, you don't really wanna stop down with this lens. I assume you're doing F2 to do F2. I'm gonna provide other samples, but we are gonna focus just on the F2 samples today. Popping into the center here, we see that we've got some chromatic aberration, and that is pretty typical, purple fringing. Spherical distortions, not really an issue with this lens. Pop over to the corners here where there's doubtlessly gonna be astigmatism. Here we go, look at all this. So this is not coma, this is astigmatism. It's 2 types of astigmatism actually, tangential, which will follow radii that fall along the center to edge axes. So wherever a star occurs, it's going to stretch out in that direction towards the center of the frame or away from the center of the frame, depending on your point of view. And that is because the lens is having trouble focusing that pinpoint as a pinpoint. And then we will have sagittal astigmatism, which occurs at a right angle. Sometimes it appears to curve a little bit. This here, it's pretty much right crossing the T's. And this, again, same thing. The lens is having trouble getting that light focused in the pinpoint. So it's spreading at a right angle to the tangential astigmatism, and that sagittal appears to ring the frame because of that, whereas the tangential will radiate from the center to the edges or fall along those radii at the very least. So that gives us this flock of seagulls in space kind of look, and this can be disruptive in your images when it causes the stars to look bigger than they should. And definitely here, I am seeing it. Like I can tell that the stars are stretched out a little bit because of that sagittal astigmatism. They are actually appearing wider than they are long, and that is noticeable. Subtle, and you can hide some of this. I assume 24 millimeters, you might be doing a little bit of foreground, maybe a Milky Way shot, so you can hide half of this at least in the foreground. Maybe you can use something creative for all of that, but it is going to be occurring. Coma doesn't appear to be a problem with this lens, although the astigmatism does come pretty close to the center here. This is at F2 at 24 mils. Coma is when the star will get a fuzzy tail like a comet. Chromatic aberration, comet, coma, that's where all that's coming from. And here we got no fuzzy tails, so we don't have any coma. We may or may not have some field curvature. Looks like maybe stars blow it out a little bit towards the edge compared to the center. It's to say that field curvature is when things are focused at different points. So if you're focused in the center, you might find that the corners or edges are out of focus. And that is something that's just a fact of life with many lenses. Although sometimes you have really flat field lenses where there's no field curvature. And at the very least, it's not manifesting strong enough to really notice if it is at all, especially not considering the astigmatism here. So I don't really think that is anything to worry about. So this is F2, 24 millimeter. This is F2.2 at 24 millimeter. We do get a bit of a darkening in the center there. A little more even exposure at 2.8. And this is 28 millimeters at F2. Look in the center really quick. Stars look okay in the center. The edges, we do have that astigmatism. You can see the sagittal, the wings are bending a little bit, and there's a little bit of a fork in the tangential. Overall, not any real better or worse, I wouldn't say. 2.2 at 28, 2.5 at 28, 2.8 at 28. Honestly, I wouldn't buy this lens and then shoot it at 2.8. It's not really rectifying the astigmatism, and it's kind of beside the point, really. Yeah, it's not worth doing. You're better off with a prime at that point. Oh boy. Okay, so this is 30 millimeters, and this is why we're gonna kind of skip over this. This, well, it could actually be a fun effect in a certain extent, but this is zoom creep. So I was using painter's tape to keep the zoom ring in the right spot, and it let go at around 30 millimeters. And so I didn't notice when I was taking the shots. So mid shot, basically, we're going to hyperspeed here. And then it ended up at 29 millimeters, which isn't that much different than 28 millimeters. So we're just gonna fast forward through this stuff and go right to 35 millimeters. So here we are, 35 f2, still vignetting, bright spot in the middle. Bright spot kind of goes away as we stop down, but so does all the light that we're gathering, so probably don't want to do that. 35 millimeter in the middle, looks okay. This might actually be a little bit of coma. I don't know if you can see that we got the star and there's like a little bit of a fuzz behind it. Yeah, it could be a little bit of a coma. Also, the center of the frame doesn't appear to actually be the center of the frame. So while the bright spot is here, the better focus is almost here, where we're starting to get astigmatism coming into play. Let's look at the corners. Here, the tangential is kind of a little bit smaller, but the sagittal is getting bigger, really spreading its wings. Look in the other corner, yeah, about the same. A little bit different in the bottom right. Bottom left is kind of a mix. And from this viewing distance, brighter stars are getting pretty big, but overall not too bad. Again, 35 millimeter f2, might just go for a prime at that point. You might get better experience there. This astigmatism is pretty typical. It's just the fact that it's appearing so big in the frame that causes a little bit of a disruption. And that color fringing there, we should be able to correct. So I believe, yeah, should be able to deal with that a little bit. This here is the handle of Ursa, of the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, and there's the spoony ladle part of it. So you can see these are fairly bright stars. So if you're going to be shooting bright stars, like the main stars on a constellation, you might want to, or an asterism, keep them in the middle if you're going to be doing this at all. Let's go into the develop module. We're going to just apply some quick corrections here. Chromatic aberration, of course, this little thing never really works on stars, and it does say it's got a built-in profile for chromatic aberration. It's automatically applied, but of course it didn't really fix those, so we'll go manual, click on the purpley blue. Oh, it looks like you can't have your purple and blue and eat it too. I don't know, let's change that a little bit. Yeah, you can get rid of some of it for the most part. That looks pretty clean. So that's pretty easy, and it wasn't a big deal to begin with. If we click profile corrections, Sigma. So if we put the profile correction on here, now keep in mind I did boost the exposure, so it is showing up as quite bright here. It is doing a good job, maybe a little overdoing it, correcting the vignetting. And you can see here we have pincushion distortion at 35 millimeters, and it's pulling that out towards the viewer to correct it. We go all the way back here to 24 millimeters and apply a profile correction. You can see there's barrel distortion at the wide end, and that's getting corrected, flattened out away from the viewer. The edges are getting pulled out to flatten them towards the viewer a little bit. And again, we're 2 stops brighter to begin with, so things are showing up a little brighter than they otherwise would, but you can definitely see it's overdoing the vignetting correction. We just reset our exposure. This is what the out of camera image looks like. And if we flip that profile correction off, you can see that it is putting a lot of exposure back into the corners there. So overall, it is what it is. I don't expect perfection from a zoom lens, especially not the world's first kind of fastest one like this. So this is pretty fine, and there are ways to use it in a way where you can minimize any of the disturbances from the corners there. So I hope you found that interesting. Let's get out of Lightroom and wrap it up. So, what'd you think of that? I would say that for the time, this lens is excellent, especially with what was available those days. These days, would I pick it up for astrophotography specifically? That's a hard one. I mean, if I'm on a Canon EF system or maybe a Nikon F system, for sure. I think this might be something that's really compelling. It's a little bit slow for 35 mil if you're going to be doing anything where you're not wanting to get star trails. So you might want to do some tracked photography, even at 24. I mean, I have used it for Aurora, which have been, fairly successful, but it was a little bit tough to get foreground exposure proper in those images. So all in all, not a bad lens. In the day and age where we have we're tripping over good f1.4 primes in the same range, the money is probably better spent in that direction. But if you already have this and you don't have the other lenses, or if you're on a DSLR mount, or if this is just more attractive financially than one of those other lenses, I would say use it. But that's just my opinion. Ultimately, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to show you what the lens is capable of so that you can make your own decisions. So I hope this video helped you do that. And as always, I'm Darren. This has been Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one. Take care. What is this? I don't know.